Hello, my name is Lisa Schmidt, and this is my presentation on the special needs brain, looking at a comparison between the special needs brain and a neurotypical brain, with a particular emphasis on the autism spectrum disorder. And so with that, I'm going to share my slide, and I'm going to go into my slideshow here. All right. We're going to be looking at some comparisons between different brains. So one of the first things I want to point out is that no two human brains are alike. Your brain is what gives you your personality. Differences in brain structure are caused by four basic things: genetics and epigenetics, environment, injury, and gender differences. So let's take those apart a little bit. So genetics are inherited characteristics. A good example of that in reference to ASD is that ASD children are significantly more likely to have one or more parents with latent obsessive compulsive traits. And that is from David Sousa's book, How the Special Needs Brain Learns, page 206. And epigenetics is the inheritable changes in gene expression, but not the gene itself. So this is a huge new area of study and may very well be a factor in the recent boom in ASD diagnosis, is actually epigenetics. The next is environment. Now, environment includes how a baby is nurtured and raised, as well as such factors as toxic stress. So we now know that children with high ACE scores, and that stands for adverse childhood experiences, can actually begin to show structural changes in their brain due to that toxic stress, particularly if it happens between 0 and 5 years old, and that can severely impact learning and have other health implications. The next one is injury. And that is injury that could happen while in utero. It can happen with parents if the mother is drinking alcohol, that's fetal alcohol syndrome, taking drugs, or even exposure to such toxins as mercury. And then injury after birth would include accidents and, let's say, a concussion due to sports, or due to an accident, which can cause actual structural changes to the brain. Last is gender. So that may seem surprising that there's that big a difference between a male brain and a female brain. There are some subtle differences. So those differences could be due to just the plain brain structure. When you see those differences in brain, we do know that boys have a much higher likelihood of having ASD than girls. I think it is, they are out of 5, 4 will be a boy and 1 will be a girl. The diagnosis for ASD may also have to do with societal expectations that then begins to impact brain growth. So for example, in our current schooling system, students are expected to be very quiet, to sit quietly, and to be able to have good relationships with their peers. Boys may not have that ability to sit quietly, and then may begin to become agitated, and that may be part of why they have diagnoses in various special needs. Okay, so here's a good old-fashioned look at the brain. We have 4 basic lobes. We have our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, our temporal lobe here on the sides, our occipital, mostly for vision, the good old tiny brain, the cerebellum back there for motor functions, hand-eye coordination, and of course the brain stem regulating all of our basic functions. The frontal lobe up here is really about thinking, planning, problem solving, emotions, behavioral control, decision making, and so that is the lobe that the area where we see impact and then behavioral changes, and then also inside in the corpus striatum. So let's take a look there. So that's the basics of how a healthy brain looks, and everybody still has all these lobes regardless of your special needs. So with autism spectrum disorder, they've taken some MRIs of the ASD brain, and they've discovered that the corpus striatum, in particular, the putamen, the palladium, the amygdala, and the nucleus accumbens have been found to actually be smaller in the ASD brain than in a healthy brain. There's also an increased thickness in the prefrontal cortex and a decreased thickness in the temporal cortex. So what does that mean? How does that look? Well, let's take a look a little bit closer here. So this illustration is showing white matter, and the white matter, so it's the gray matter on the outside, and then under that is the white matter. So David Souza writes in How the Special Needs Brain Learns in the 2016 that an increase in white matter found in the ASD brain is disproportionate to other brains. And this imbalance makes it impossible for the brains to interconnect so many brain cells. So what they discovered is that in an ASD child, there is much quicker brain growth than there is in a normal child, building up in that white matter. And that is just too much white matter for everything to connect and work. And that could be a serious cause for some of the dysfunction that we see in the ASD behavior. Also, when we're seeing, this is happening up particularly, like we said, in this frontal lobe. So if we're having difficulties with function because of this excess white matter, this early development of white matter, this is where decision making, being able to understand relationships, being able to read another person's emotions through their voice and through their face, that's going to be affected. And then in the smaller corpus striatum, which includes the amygdala, that if that is actually smaller, that's where you are able to develop empathy and compassion, to be able to really understand those strong emotions. So if both the prefrontal cortex is enlarged with this white matter, which is sort of making a lot of noise, and the amygdala and the corpus striatum is decreased, you could see how those behaviors that are common, those symptoms that are common with ASD students are going to show up, which is going to be in the difficulty in reading a person's emotions, tapping into compassion. So I see with a lot of my ASD students, they seem to be detached. They seem to be uninterested. They are frequently unable to engage in any kind of small talk. Some may seem completely uncommunicative until you get to a topic which intensely interests them, in which case they can go on and on, almost in an obsessive manner, talking about their favorite topic, unable to read the audience that they're talking to see that their audience is disinterested or bored. For example, I have a student who is obsessed with trains. He will be basically non-responsive until we can incorporate the concept of trains into any task at hand. And then that will get him back interested in that topic. So you can see how that brain structure is impacting behavior and teaching. All right, this is a photograph of one of my classes. This is a dance rehearsal. So some of the major symptoms of autism spectrum disorder are social interaction, communication difficulty, both verbal and nonverbal, and restrictive, repetitive behaviors. And so I wanted to show you this slide because some people may think that students with autism may not be interested in the performing arts, and that's not true. I have many students who are very interested in the performing arts, just like anybody with a neurotypical brain. Some people are interested and some people are not. I feel it's very important that if an ASD student is interested in the performing arts, it is incumbent upon us to give them an opportunity to express that interest. And so regardless of functioning level, whether this is a high functioning person or a low functioning person, we want to make sure that they have a chance to express their talents and find joy. Now, someone with ASD proves to be a very challenging student when it comes to the performing arts, because music, dance, and theater require collaboration, teamwork, coming to consensus, creative thinking, and emotional expression. All of these can be extraordinarily challenging for someone with ASD. So what we have found that our ASD high functioning students are able to master technically very quickly. So they are able to learn the dance steps. They are able to learn the notes of the song. They are able to learn the dialogue very quickly, but it is all delivered in a very robotic way. Secondly, our students with severe ASD are frequently unable to speak or move with speed. So they are not given speaking roles. Of course, they cannot make entrances or exits quickly. They have no speedy movements. They can't drum or play instruments quickly. And so we make adjustments. The third thing is that our students often have repetitive behaviors. They need to be redirected from those impaired repetitive behaviors. And also we see a lot of stemming, which is that stimulation that helps with calming. And so when we see a lot of stemming, which can look like hand flapping or patting or clapping, which we take that as a signal as teachers to stop, to slow down, and to discover why the student is becoming agitated and needing this stemming. Or if it's more severe, like biting or head banging, then we'll take a big stop and figure out if there is some environmental factor that's going on at that moment where we really need to make an adjustment. So understanding the causes of stemming and how the brain is reacting to that stimulus is very important in how we use our classroom strategies. This next is an article, a section of an article I pulled from High Functioning Autism from a website called healthline.com. This article was written by Kimberly Holland and reviewed by Dr. Timothy Legg. And in it, they list 6 different basic therapies or treatments for high functioning autism. And so I want to go through these. I found them very helpful. That's speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, sensory training, and applied behavioral analysis. Now, the last one, medication, we don't do at all, but we do work on the first 5. And so I want to describe how I'm using those in my teaching and our work at our program. So speech therapy is obvious that we are working with pronunciation. We're working with practice on dialogue, development of conversations. So that's constant in our work. Physical therapy, gross motor is addressed through dance. And we actually have physical therapists that work with us on that. On the speech therapy, we have musical therapists that again are working with how to articulate the lyrics of the songs. For occupational therapy, that happens through the use of common props and being able to do simple things like making entrances and exits. Sensory training, I'm going to get into a little bit in a second. And then, of course, applied behavioral analysis. The students really want to perform. And so the big reward at the end is the opportunity to perform on a classroom, each classroom by classroom. There's always an opportunity to perform and to be applauded, but then also to work towards the big performance at the end. So I wanted to take apart for a second a little bit about the sensory training and how we step that in. So at each rehearsal, we're slowly adding different elements. So first we'll add the actual instruments, the musicians playing it, so that the students get used to hearing, oh, there's another person in the room. This is what it's like to hear a live piano, live drums. We'll take an entire rehearsal just to add the lighting so that they can see what it's like to have different levels of lighting, or the lighting coming into their eyes when they're on stage. We also add different levels of platforms that they may have to step and climb up, because that's a sensory difference. The actual fabric of the costumes, how they get used to those, is very different. And so we add each element one at a time. The rehearsals are they have a pattern to them. We always start in a certain way. We always end in a certain way. We move from part of rehearsal to part of rehearsal, from class to class in a certain way. The more planning that we put into rehearsals, the less stimming we see, and the more opportunity for our students to begin to express original ideas, and to be able to express their own independence. So these are very important, and they're included in our classes teaching strategies. So I think it's important to define a to have a distinction between high functioning and low functioning ASD, because the spectrum is so very broad. So in high functioning, I've decided, and in this differentiation, I've decided to use some differences that were described in an article written by Lisa Jo Rudy for verywellhealth.com, in an article called "What's the Difference Between High and Low Functioning Autism?" I prefer that to the DSM-5 definition of the differences of high and low, because they're basically defining it on how much assistance a person needs. But we've found that a student can be very high functioning in class, but very low functioning in navigating transportation, or even eating, or working in being able to function in a kitchen. And so how much assistance a person needs varies from situation to situation. So I like this definition better. They say high functioning people use spoken language to communicate. High functioning people are more likely to able to manage the expectations of an academic setting. High functioning people are usually more aware of social conventions. And we found that to be true. Low functioning people generally look and sound very different from their peers. Low functioning people are less likely to be included in typical class activities, and more likely to be substantially separate academic settings. So those are the ones that we like to use that help us in differentiating. So with that, these are strategies that we use for both our high and low functioning. One, we make lessons predictable and routine. We minimize sensory overload, look out for stressors. We give students physical space so that they never feel trapped or in a corner. We slowly add new elements and challenges. We use speech and visual cues simultaneously. So I don't just don't give direction verbally, but I also have it on a whiteboard, and we also have charts and pictures that we use so that they can follow along. We always try to engage in pre-existing interests as much as possible. And finally, encourage a sense of humor and joy. And that's something that is unique, I found, to my program. I haven't seen that show up in a lot of different research that I'm looking at, but we think engaging a sense of humor and joy is extremely important, regardless of whether our students are verbal or nonverbal. So there's a lot of, we tell a lot of jokes. We try to find humor whenever possible, both physical humor and verbal humor. And for our nonverbal students, we try to find ways to get a lot of smiles and pleasure out of maybe hearing a melody, putting your hand on the piano to hear those vibrations, the tactile feel of a prop. And so it may be when we ask a question of our nonverbal students, they may give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, whether or not they like something. Or for our students who are not even able to control their hands, what we might get is a smile, that they are enjoying something. And that kind of, when they smile, then the whole cast smiles, and we find joy in that moment. And so that's really important, uh, because I think that's what brings us all back together to want to keep working and improving. So here we have a photograph of a rehearsal, and you can see in the center of the photograph there is a teacher, a dance teacher, who is wearing a green t-shirt. We always put our staff in green, we put our volunteers in red, our helpers, so that at any time we can find those helpers. And so I would like to take a moment to take apart how the young lady who is in the center there wearing the pink shirt, she was predominantly came to us as low functioning, nonverbal, very stiff, very cut off. She was very physically slow and cautious, but with careful practice over years of work, now 5 years of working with her, this is her learning how to do a tango with the young man who's high functioning. And you'll see the other dancers are standing around her. They aren't doing a tango, she is, and then they're going to do a simple step around her. So how did we get her and able to actually do a tango? So we started, she began just sitting on the sidelines watching a dance rehearsal early on, and then slowly we got her, took away the chair and said, now you will stand and sway when the others are doing dancing. Then she began to do dancing just with one hand touching a volunteer, so still keeping a lot of sensory, paying attention to her sensory aversions to touching people and closeness, but they began to move, doing the steps hand to hand, to eventually bringing her out with a volunteer and dancing, and then eventually able to dance with another partner on the stage. And now you can see in this particular photograph, she's surrounded by people and able to do a fairly complicated series of movements that was indeed the steps of a tango. And we also found, perhaps not surprisingly, that as she was able to move up in her physical ability, she also was gaining in her verbal ability, being able to speak more than just yes and no, but to articulate full sentences, and even to begin to smile and show some emotions that she was pleased. And so we were really happy with that. So this is a demonstration of how we understand how to bring in those strategies to work with those students that are ASD. All right. So our next slide here, oh, is this my next slide? Yes, is some instructional strategies that I'm only using for our higher functioning students, because those are the ones who can read. So we print scripts with very large font size and only on one side, so that the flipping of those sides doesn't become confusing. We state expectations very clearly. We allow them time to process those instructions. And then we break those tasks into manageable segments and plan for a completion schedule. So for our high functioning students, we may say, you need to have this part of the script memorized for this point. You need to be able to manipulate this particular prop, such as catching a ball by this time. So we'll give you this week to practice that. We did find that our ASD students were able to memorize very quickly, but what they needed the most time to adjust to was that there may be changes in the script. There may be some small changes in the blocking to accommodate other players, and also to give them a lot of time to adjust to their costume. So they had to begin to mentally prepare that there could be some changes to what they had already memorized, to prepare for that, which is helping them in basic social interaction, that there are going to be changes that you're going to have to adapt to. One of the biggest problems we have with the ASD students is their sensitivity to sound. So we allow the use of earplugs and headphones to block out sound during rehearsals, but slowly we take those away over the course of rehearsals. We also use technology, headphones with microphones, so that they can speak into a microphone at a lower level and the sound is projected into the audience but not projected onto the stage, so that no one is screaming or yelling too loudly, which would cause too much agitation, which would then result in the stemming on the stage during rehearsal. So we try to build up to that. All right, so coming to an end, future practice and family involvement. Well, there was one rule that I absorbed, which just can't be said enough, which is avoid doing for students what they can do for themselves. And that's a really tough one for the staff. It's tough for me. It's tough for parents, because we want to quickly jump in and try to make it better, to make it easier for another student, to ease that agitation. And we need to make sure that we're taking that time, slowing down to really allow those students to make adjustments where they can, to figure out those small adjustments. I can't stand here, but I'd rather stand here. Is that okay? Yes, it's okay. As opposed to us just saying, oh, that's bothering you, let me move you. Letting them figure that out for themselves. There's a lot of pressure, of course, to get the production going. And so a lot of times we're saying, no, just do it this way, as opposed to taking that time to hear the students' creative ideas. And a lot of them have creative ideas. Both our verbal and our nonverbal may indicate different ways that they want to do things. And we need to make time to incorporate those creative ideas whenever possible, so that the final production is their voice and not our voice. Parents likewise, a lot of times they're asked to work with their students on memorizing dialogue, dance sections, songs, and the students may say, well, I would rather do it this way. And instead of saying, no, we have to do it the way the director said, really taking into consideration those creative ideas, and then finding a way to bring those into rehearsal, either written down for the student or by email, because students often are nervous and don't want to express ideas when they're in rehearsal, but in the safety of their own home, that's where they may be coming up with these really great ideas. And we need to bring them in, because the inclusion of students' original artistic ideas is incredibly empowering to them. It builds up their confidence that they have something to say, that their opinions are valuable, their ideas are valuable, and in fact, they are worthy and valuable. And that is really the most important part of our program. The last slide includes some of the resources that we used. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing this slide. That ends my presentation, and I'd like to say thank you very much for listening.